Thank you very much for taking the time and trouble to come here this evening. In what we are hoping will become an annual keynote address, Rocky Mountain has invited one of the great and good of our industry. And in this instance, we've got one of the greatest and best, someone who I think it's fair to say, without his influence, we wouldn't have a high-end industry. It's both an honor and a pleasure to welcome Harry Pearson.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to sit down during this tonight. I fell plague to the dehydration complex of Denver. I've never been this high on natural stuff before. And they warned me, drink plenty of water. And so I've been going like a house ablaze for 2 days, and all of a sudden I'm in the middle of the atrium, no Jack Daniels at hand or anything, and what happens? I feel faint. So this lady says, let me get you some water. And I said, okay. And she gets me water and said, I know that you're dehydrated. And she said, I went through this once. And I said, yeah, what happened? She said, well, I went to see Dick Cheney, and I fainted right in front of him. And I said, well, I would faint in front of him too, but not for the reason you did. What I want to do, guys, is I want to talk about past a bit and where we were, how we got to here and what we accomplished, and then we go to the transition. And the transition is the most important thing I think I can talk about, and it's the thing we'll argue about. How do we get to the future? And we'll take questions, obviously, about halfway through. And if anybody starts preaching like somebody did yesterday, okay? That like that. Well, all right. Okay, first of all, there are two reasons I'm here, or started me on my road here. One of them was Gordon Holt. And if you haven't heard, there's a cocktail party for Gordon right after this that B. Lamb is throwing where?
Up on the peak level outside the Audiofest.
And it's a martini party. And I get to have a chocolate martini, okay? But Gordon was the guy I used to read when I was in high school. I first read him in all the magazines. He wrote for what was called then Stereo Review, before it became Hi-Fi Review. Then it became Hi-Fi Stereo Review. Then it became Stereo Review. And then surprisingly, they came with this title, Sound and Vision. Couldn't imagine where they got it from. But, and he and Julian Hirsch were in the same issue a lot of times. Then he went to High Fidelity, which was then High Fidelity. And he reviewed the KLH Model 9s. And the son of the guy who did it is here, David Jansen. And he's got a room upstairs with his new electrostatics, which you might want to hear. I reviewed them. He's not here to pay me for this, is he? No? Okay. And what Gordon did was he ran a full review on the KLH Model 9, and he said it was one of the best speakers he ever heard, and he loved it. Well, High Fidelity's advertisers got angry. How can he review our speaker if he says this is the best? So Gordon quit. And what Gordon did after a while was set up an alternative magazine. They called it Underground then, but it was really alternative. It was an answer to what was there. And it was where all of us who got sick and tired of the commercial magazines went to read to find out what it really sounded like. Because the commercial magazines would give you the measurements. And they say, but the measurements are essentially perfect. So we'll talk about how many knobs it has, how many lights it has, and on and on and on. And you'd never hear how it sounded. And Gordon started working on a vocabulary. And he came up with some of the basic terms like transparency, so on and so forth, and started like the matrix. For me, it was the matrix because I could build on that. The other person was Wilma Cozart, Wilma Cozart Fine, who just died a week ago Monday. After a 2-year illness. And I have been assigned to do a piece on her, and so I've been looking into Wilma, doing an in search of Wilma Cozart. But you know what she did? She told me the first time we met, when I lured her out of retirement, and I really did. She said, trust your ears. Said, if the techno freaks come down, like, say, from the mountain at Framingham, and say, this is how it's supposed to sound, we have the measurement, and it doesn't sound like, don't believe them. No matter what people tell you about the measurements, don't believe it if you don't trust your ears. And why do you trust your ears? Because you love music, and she did. She worked for the Dallas Symphony under Antal Dorati, went with him to Minneapolis, and then went to Mercury, where she met the guy she was going to marry, who was the best engineer in the business, Bob Fine. And you think about her, all the records they put out, they never put out a really bad sounding one. Think about it. Even RCA put out bad sounding ones. They have the best sonic record of any company. You know why? The simplest technique. One mic for mono at the focal point of the hall. For stereo, they added 2 more mics to the side on that focal point plane. And you can listen to their records today, and there was no jiggering with the sound or anything. So she lives on right now. And she put the passion of the music first. So if you guys aren't here because you love the music, you're in the wrong business. I saw audio when I started. I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina, and we didn't have any music. So I used to get records, which I could promptly break, of course. And I had this mad passion for music. And when I first heard my first hi-fi system, I realized how much music I'd been missing by listening to the players of the time. And I suddenly decided to pursue this because I wanted to get into the music, not into the equipment. Audio equipment is simply a vehicle to get you to the music. And if it doesn't do that, if it's high definition or hi-fi, and it doesn't give you a sense of music, it's not really good. And that goes back to trust your ears. What do? You listen to real music, you go to concerts, you support musicians, you do. And then when you do that, you can judge anything. If a viola sounds like a cello, wrong. If the lower thing of a cello sounds like a string bass, wrong. If a flute sounds like a piccolo, wrong. And if you know these things, nobody can fool you. So those are the first 2 things that started me out. And I think I defined the term high-end. And I used it the first time anywhere. And now I read the magazines and I find that they're high-end dildos. There are. There was another thing I think my magazine did, which people kept saying, how do I know what is a good sounding record? So I created a super disc list. And what I did was create a super disc market for super disc, and the prices became super prices. And in 1985, my house almost burned down, and a lot of my records were destroyed. And guess what? Guess who couldn't afford to replace the records that he was using as reference? The rich irony of this is I created it, and then it ate me. But those records today, and especially the Mercurys and some of the RCAs, still you can use as reference. And the more minimally mic'd they are, the truer they are. And it really is true. These days, you have so many microphones that the flute is louder than the trumpet. Not right. Perspective. You want a sense of space. That's what Bob Fine did. Space. You've got to have the space of the music. You've got to have the depth. And he had the soundstage concept, which I read about on the back of Mercury's. And when I first heard a soundstage, was what I call the QRS-1D, or the Infinity IRS, I realized that you're supposed to create an entire width of the orchestra. And when we started this back then, every speaker had fridges and beveled edges. And so they didn't create any space. You had to get rid of all the distractions to create, and I had this guy from somewhere overseas, Asia, who kept saying, the 2 microphones are like this. You can't have space. I said, microphones aren't like eyes. They have wide angles. When he'd write me every week. I don't hear the width. I said, well, get some good equipment. I have to tell you one more thing to get a transition point. We went from measurement